Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Blair Bazdarich in San Francisco, California. Blair is an education program specialist at the San Francisco Zoo, where she has also held the titles of zookeeper and zoo camp lead. She's also the co-host of a great podcast called This Week in Science. Twists was recently nominated as one of the best science podcasts at the Academy of Podcasters Awards. Blair, thank you for joining me today, and congratulations on your nomination.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I mentioned just before we got started that I've actually worked with a couple of clients over the years who have either worked at a zoo or wanted to work at a zoo, and so I think that this podcast will be very informative for those people.
Yeah, I mean, it is really a competitive field, and there's a few different ways to go about getting in there, and I'd love to share my story for sure.
Great. Well, can you start off by sharing a little bit about what you actually do at the San Francisco Zoo? I shared your title, but what are you doing there kind of day to day?
Yeah, so I've done a bunch of different jobs at the zoo and at other facilities that all involve education, a couple things that don't. And so as an education program specialist, I help facilitate all of the different programs that we offer at the zoo, but I also now develop education and conservation education content for things like exhibits, events, teacher and family web resources, and then I also run and facilitate our guided tour program at the zoo on weekends for families. And so that's definitely very fun because occasionally I get to step in and deliver the programs myself, which is still one of my favorite things for sure.
Oh, that's great. So how do you decide really what to develop content around? I mean, are there certain areas that people are more interested in or that are more important?
Yeah, so we definitely always have new exhibits happening. Our zoo is almost 90 years old, so we're always updating exhibits, building new exhibits. There's constant turnover. So whenever we have a new exhibit, there's a lot of interest in that area of the zoo, and it also gives us a chance to update all of our signage and develop new programming and resources for those spaces. So that's definitely number one, doing that. Then, as science content standards change for schools, for example, we have the Next Generation Content Standards, Next Generation Science Standards, the NGSS. It's coming down the line pretty fast. I think the new plan for implementation is 2017 for full implementation in all of California for the school districts. We then want to align all of our programming with that so that we can be the most useful for teachers. The zoo's number one goal, in my opinion, is to educate the public and specifically, of course, kids about wildlife and conservation. And the easiest way to do that is to help and partner with teachers.
I love that. And that probably means that you have a lot of different things to keep up with in terms of standards that are always changing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a great reason to keep up on all of that. And of course, that works hand in hand with my podcast as well, because I have to stay on top of science news and I have to stay on top of best practices for teaching and on communication research and tactics as well.
Absolutely. Well, so you have worn a lot of hats and you wear a lot of hats at the zoo. What's kind of your favorite part about working at the zoo?
You'd have to ask me each day it changes, but ultimately I think it's making a really meaningful connection with a guest or a group of guests. An idea comes to mind. It's usually when there's a particular, usually it's a kid, that I have a really long conversation with, and in the end you can tell that they got it and that they really are inspired. And just a few weeks ago, we had our Wildcat weekend at the zoo, and I was helping out at our craft table, and this 12-year-old girl came up to me and told me she wanted to be a conservationist. Not that she wanted to be a zookeeper, not that she wanted to work at a zoo, which are both awesome dreams as well, but she specifically said she wants to be a conservationist, which is so intense. And we had this long conversation about how to do that and all the different ways you can be a conservationist. and she was asking me about how to volunteer at the zoo as a teen. And at the end, she started to walk away. I gave her my email address. She turned around, she ran back and gave me a big hug.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, and it's moments like that where you really realize that you're making a difference. Because if I can help shape that young girl's life and career path, that means I'm shaping the lives of all the people she later comes in contact with, which is ultimately why I love working in education. You're not just teaching one person at a time, you're teaching all the people that they will later teach.
Absolutely. And I think so often changes in life, they come in those moments where you learn something or you're inspired. So that's awesome. Well, so when did you start working at the zoo and how did you get involved? Like, how were you able to get your foot in the door?
Yeah, so I started 15 years ago this summer, actually, at the zoo, and I was 13 years old.
Oh, wow.
So I grew up 3 blocks from the zoo. I had been going to the zoo multiple times a week for my whole life, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Even when I started volunteering when I was 13, I wasn't sure I wanted to work at the zoo. I knew I loved animals, but I also had this side of me where I loved acting. I was an actor in elementary school.
Oh, okay.
All the plays. And I wasn't sure. And I started volunteering there. People kept asking me, oh, so you're going to be a vet when you grow up, right? You love animals, you're going to be a vet. And I was never really interested in that side of things. Can't tell you exactly why, but it wasn't my cup of tea. And then I started volunteering there because it seemed like this magical place that was such an important part of my life. And so I started volunteering there when I was 13 on the nature trail in the summer. So we hold smaller animals like snakes or hedgehogs and talk to people about them as they walk around the trail. And then when I was in high school, I was able to become a junior zoologist, which means you help care for the animals that live on the nature trail and go out in the zoomobile, all of our education animals, and then you do a little bit of interpretation during the day as well. But you get to do that year-round. So I volunteered on weekends when I was in high school and in the summer. And then I started taking internships. So in summer 2005, I got my first paid job at the zoo. I was right out of high school. And I ran the nature trail. I was the nature trail intern. So that was fun. That was my first little full circle that I did. Then while I was in college, I did zoo camp internships. So I helped run the zoo camp classes during the summer. And then during the school year, I was a wild nights guide. So I slept overnight at the zoo with school groups and with Girl Scout groups and stuff like that. So I would drive down from school and stay overnight with those groups and then drive back to school the next day and study. And so I had all these different jobs, and then coming out of college, I was the zoo camp lead, so I actually helped run zoo camp, which was intense and super fun. And then I had what I thought would be my last internship ever. I was the zoomobile intern for the whole school year after that, and I helped facilitate and deliver zoomobile programs in classrooms for that whole school year.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what were you studying while you were in college?
I went to Sonoma State, and I got a biology degree, and my emphasis was zoology. So I was really lucky. I went to a school that, it's a state school, and for some reason they keep a very small student body, which is great because I had an amazing relationship with all of my professors. Most of my classes had no more than 30 kids in them, students. And so all of my professors got to know us, and we also went on field trips a lot because our class sizes were so small. And then because they allowed for concentrations, we got to specify exactly which classes we wanted to take. So I didn't have to take a bunch of microbiology classes because that wasn't what I was interested in studying or pursuing in later life. So I got to take these really awesome classes that were super intense into the stuff I was interested in, and we would drive to Bodega Bay for the day and go tide pooling and discover all the critters in there. And then we went on a weekend trip to the Mojave Desert and caught lizards and snakes. And so it was this really amazing experience, and it was really unusual, I think, for a college experience. A lot of people for undergrad don't experience that.
That's exactly what I was just thinking. I mean, it sounds incredible and definitely very, very different. When it comes to your career at the zoo, also, starting at such a young age, do you find that that's typical for a lot of people who work at the zoo, that they got involved really young, or is your story a little bit unique in that way?
We have a fair amount of people who work at the zoo who started as teen volunteers. And I think that that's not unusual in the zoo community, because a lot of zoos have teen volunteer programs. We also have a whole other group of employees who started as adult volunteers. And that's also not that unusual in the zoo community. Almost all zoos have volunteer programs. Zoos are nonprofits, so in order for them to give the best quality animal care and to be able to offer all sorts of awesome educational experiences, they really can't pay everybody to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this community, there's almost every single zoo. I don't think I've ever come across a zoo that doesn't take volunteers at any age.
Sure.
Any age over 13.
Well, that's good to know. Well, so, we talked about your background, and, you've been things like a zookeeper, and that's very typical for what I would think of it as a zoo. But are there other kinds of jobs, more sort of business-related functions that people have at the zoo?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think about working at the zoo and they immediately think zookeeper, and that is definitely the frontline job that you see the most, that's the most visible in the community, but it takes so much more to keep a zoo going. There are hundreds of people that work at a zoo, and they all work together. Without each individual department, the zoo can't run. So we definitely have custodial, we have marketing, we have development. That's very important, obviously. We have our education department. We have horticulture. Horticulture is huge. Actually, our zoo just changed its name to San Francisco Zoo and Gardens, because we have such an amazing horticulture staff, and we have such amazing plants and gardens in the zoo that we really wanted to start to highlight that. And graphics department is huge too. Think about all the signs, all of our marketing that we do all has to have graphics on it. And so for a really good example of that is actually we have World Rhino Day coming up on in September. I think it's the 19th. And we need pretty much every single department working together to make this really special day. And so we have special signage that goes up from graphics. Marketing promotes the event. Animal care, they have special keeper talks during the day, so zookeepers will come out and give special enrichment. And then, of course, education and conservation is huge because we have tables. And our conservation department is growing right now, and we're so excited for it. Conservation and wellness together are doing a lot to restore wild populations of animals, and then also figure out new ways and better ways to ensure the wellness of our animals at the zoo. So we just had a fundraising campaign recently to make something called a foobler, which is a dog toy that program to release treats at a certain time or when the animal does certain things. I think you sync it with your smartphone. Mm-hmm. And so we ran a fundraiser to try to design one rhino-sized.
Oh my gosh, really?
And so we're going to hopefully be trying that out with our black rhino pretty soon. And that's another great example, is we had to have marketing promote that so that people could help crowdsource it. And then we have education interpreting it, and they're going to be out there talking about it when it goes out. And then, of course, our wellness program is developing it and actually doing the research behind it. And they might even be able to publish some stuff based on it. So that would be really awesome, too.
That's great. I really love that you touched on so many different areas, because how fun would it be, to do marketing for a zoo, or to do operations, or to be, the graphics person. I never even thought about the fact that you would have someone on staff to help you with all those signs and all that information that you're sharing. That's really neat.
Yeah, and then we also take internships in a lot of those areas sometimes. And then also I wanted to mention that a lot of those areas, people take those jobs and they haven't necessarily ever worked in a zoo before.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, if you're working in zookeeping, you need experience with animals. And if you're working in education, you need some sort of experience in teaching. Animals is helpful, but again, not necessary. If you're working in marketing, you can learn about the zoo, but the stuff that we're hiring for isn't related to animals.
Right, right.
So that's definitely something to keep in mind, too, is that it's never too late to kind of jump into the conservation field.
That's a great point. And, a lot of the people that I speak with are people who are sort of midstream, that are in their 30s or their 40s, and they've been working in this corporate job forever, and they're exhausted by it, and they want to switch to a nonprofit. And a lot of times they'll say something like, gosh, I really love the zoo. I wish I could find a way to work at the zoo. If there's someone who feels that way, like, what can we do to sort of get our foot in the door and to move in that direction? Like, do you have some advice for us?
Well, if you're able to take an internship or something like that, that's always a great way to get your foot in the door. The way I look at internships, I thought I was done doing internships right after I was out of college, and I did what I thought was my last internship. And then I was zookeeping part-time here, and I took an internship at the age of 25, which to me felt late because I was out of school for so long and I had done so many internships. But I packed my bags and I moved to Israel for 6 months, and I took an internship at the Jerusalem Zoo.
Oh, wow.
And I was a zookeeper there for 6 months, and it was a crazy thing for me to do. I admit to this day, it's one of the craziest things I've ever done. And it totally changed the course of my life and my career. And you kind of have to take that leap of faith sometimes. I took out a personal loan, and I bought a plane ticket across the world, and I didn't get paid for 6 months and got the most experience perhaps ever.
Wow. How did you decide to do that?
I wasn't sure what my next step was. I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep zookeeping. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back into education. I wasn't sure if I wanted to move. I had no idea. And rather than take an even larger leap of faith, what it seemed like to me, to try to just completely transplant, I wanted to try something. Mm-hmm. And so the opportunity presented itself. Someone from a program in Israel called me and said that they offered internships. And I jokingly said, well, I'll go if you can put me in the Jerusalem Zoo.
Oh, my gosh.
And they said, actually, we have contacts there. We can do that. And I started mentally packing that day.
Okay.
And I think it was 3 months later I got on a plane. So it was a huge leap of faith. I knew no one else there. I didn't know a single soul in that country. And I went for it. And it definitely gave me a bunch of experience. I have something called a species vitae. It's a list of all the species I've ever worked with.
Okay.
I doubled that list in my internship.
That's so great.
Yeah, and they just threw me into situations where I was able to gain hands-on experience in a way I don't think I ever could have otherwise. So internships, I think, are huge because you're either not getting paid or you're getting paid very little because you're getting paid in experience. And people know that, and especially if you get hooked in with a good mentor in the process, you can learn so much, and the connections you make are huge. In the zoo community in particular, connections are a lot.
Yeah,
because there are well-qualified people all over the country and world that want to work in zoos.
Absolutely. I think you make a good point when you say you're being paid in experience, because as we get older, I think we start to develop this idea that, hey, I'm not a kid anymore, I should be paid. And I think you are being paid, as you said.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, hooking yourself in with a few people that can help influence your career is that you can't put a price on it. I've met a few people in particular throughout my life that I've been able to come back to and take meetings with when I'm about to make what I think may be a crazy decision. And they've always helped steer me in the right direction.
No, that's awesome.
Just a couple years ago, when I got back from Israel, I took a job at an aquarium. And that seemed crazy to me because all I had ever known was zoos and land animals. I considered my specialty at the time African-hooved mammals. And then I took a job at Aquarium of the Bay in San Francisco. And I knew nothing about fish at all. And that ended up being so important. That job totally helped steer me in the direction that I'm going now. I was able to start a program from the ground up, going into classrooms and teaching climate change to kids. So I developed curriculum. I bought a van. I helped outfit the van. I helped design a van wrap. I marketed the program. I trained staff, and then I helped execute the program. This was all through a grant, so I learned grant reporting and how to write grants, and I made amazing contacts through the process as well. So.
Wow, that's fantastic.
That allowed me to then come back to the zoo with more qualifications. If I had stayed at the zoo, I wouldn't have learned everything that I learned in that process.
Right. Well, so the other thing that kind of came through with your story about Israel is the fact that you picked up everything and you moved to another country. And I speak with a lot of people who really want to move and they want to go to another country or another city, and they feel scared, and it holds them back till the point that they don't do it. How were you able to sort of overcome that kind of fear?
I think it helped that I had family and friends that were really supportive of it. Mm-hmm. It really helped that they embraced it. I remember getting off the phone, deciding I was going to do this, and then going and talking to my parents, and they had the weirdest look on their face, like, you're going to do what now? Mm-hmm. But they said, okay, great, let's start packing. They just kind of let it wash over them, and they accepted it. And they didn't call me crazy. They let me call myself crazy, but they didn't call me crazy. They really helped support me. The other thing is I really don't see any big leap that you take as permanent. Nothing is permanent. And so if you try it and you don't like it, come back or go somewhere else. And you never know unless you try. And I think that ultimately what I've learned is to never turn something down if you can see positives to doing it. And especially in this career, never turn anything down if it seems along your career path and you can make it work.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, so I've heard that, working at or volunteering for a zoo, like you mentioned earlier, it's quite competitive. So, if we're listening today and we'd like to volunteer for a zoo for the first time, do you have any tips on how to kind of get through that competition?
Yeah, so volunteer jobs, they are competitive, but it kind of depends on timing. So if you don't get accepted the first time, don't give up. Keep applying. The other thing is, like I learned from jumping from the zoo to the aquarium world because the zoo wasn't ready for me and I wasn't ready for the zoo full-time yet, is if you have a specific zoo or facility in mind, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go try something else first. So try other zoos, aquariums, wildlife networks, rehab facilities, anything that's similar. Try to get in there in the area as well, because experience is experience. And if you're coming with no animal experience and you want to work with animals, getting any sort of animal experience, even if it's volunteering at the SPCA, is something. And that's going to help give you an edge on other people. So, yeah, again, not turning anything down, casting a wide net, and then keeping up contacts is really important too. And almost being in this career is almost like being an actor in some ways, I feel like, because it's almost like you're going on audition, and you don't expect to get every single part that you audition for. So you play your odds, right? So you audition for a lot of different gigs until you get one. And it's the same because it's such a sought-after field. You just apply to jobs, and eventually someone will call you back.
Mm-hmm. No, that's excellent advice. I completely agree. Well, I'd love to kind of transition over to your podcast. You and I actually met recently at the podcast movement, which was in Texas. And you were there because your podcast Twists, like I said earlier, was nominated for the Academy of Podcasters Awards, which is awesome.
Yeah, that was so
But for those of us who are listening that maybe haven't heard your podcast before, can you tell us a little bit about what Twists is all about?
Sure. So This Week in Science, Twists, is a weekly podcast, and it's a little unusual for a few reasons. So the first is that you can listen to it on iTunes, or you can watch it on YouTube. So it is a video podcast as well. And the other element of it that's really unusual and fun is that it's live. So we tape on Wednesday nights at 8 o'clock Pacific time, and we allow listeners and viewers to join us in a live chat room. And so the three of us, it's me and Dr. Kirsten Sanford. She's got a doctorate in neuroscience. And then Justin Jackson, who he calls himself an armchair physicist. So he is basically a science enthusiast. And so the three of us, we bring articles from the week of science news, publications that have come through, and we discuss them. So each of us will take turns presenting our article that we looked up and researched, and then we have a discussion about them.
That's great. So how long has the podcast been around, and how long have you been a part of the podcast?
Well, the start of the podcast is unclear. It started sometime between 1998 and 2000. It actually started as a radio show on KDVS, which is the radio station at UC Davis, California. And Dr. Kiki, she started the show. And then they were one of the very first podcasts before iTunes even carried podcasts. It was an RSS feed on their website.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
Yeah. So they've been around for a long time. I've been on the show, it seems to me like it was just yesterday. I've been on the show for about 3.5 years.
Okay. So you shared this with me before, but I think it's a really interesting story. Can you tell us how you got into podcasting?
Yeah, it's actually kind of a funny story. So I've always been interested in performing, and I've always had a particular interest in TV or radio or something like that where I would talk about animals to the public. That's always been something that's kind of been a pipe dream of mine. And then I was zookeeping, which I absolutely loved, and it was really physical, and it was really engaging. But I wanted something more academic to go on in my personal life as well, kind of like a hobby. And my dad loves podcasts, and he was listening to This Week in Science, and he heard them have a call for interns. He told me about it. I listened to some episodes, loved the show, and I emailed Kiki about the internship. Now, this is the funniest part to me, is that at the end of each episode, we say, put TWIS, T-W-I-S, into the subject line, or your email will be spam filtered into oblivion. And I did not put TWIS in my subject line.
Okay.
And it took a few months for Kiki to find my email.
Oh, no.
And so I didn't think that they picked me, especially because I'm not a student. I didn't have any experience. I didn't think that I would be selected anyway. I kind of just threw it out there. You don't succeed if you don't try, right? And so then a few months later, she reached out to me. She said she wanted to meet up for coffee and chat. And we chatted, and she said, well, I can give you credits. And I said, I have nothing to do with credits. I'm not in school. And so we just talked about our goals and the way it would work, and I started the next week.
That's great. So the thing I really love about this story is, well, first, that your dad listens to podcasts, but also that you were, again, open to taking an internship when you were clearly at a professional stage, in your life.
Yeah, well, it was into something that I didn't have professional experience with. So, in a way, my two different worlds of the podcast and the zoo are very different, but they're also very similar. I think about going on a stage and talking about animals, which I've done so many times and talking to groups and taking questions and designing and writing shows or presentations. And then I think about presenting on a podcast, and they're not that different. And to a certain extent, communication is communication, right? But I hadn't been part of, quote, the media before. And so that was very scary and new. But it was also something I knew I was interested in. So I was happy to do it for free and just try something. And they gave me tasks that were mostly off-air to start. I was doing things like updating the website and show notes and doing social media for them and helping field things during the show. Since it is a live show, there's a lot going on. And then they threw me on air a couple times, and then a couple more times, a couple more, and then right around before I left for Israel, one show they said, well, this is dumb, you're a co-host now.
So how long did it take from when you started your internship to becoming a co-host?
It was almost a year.
Okay.
Not quite, actually. I would say it was probably 8 or 9 months.
Yeah. And when you were in Israel, did you continue to participate in the show?
I did. So the time difference is 9 or 10 hours, depending on daylight savings. And so I would wake up. At the time, we were doing Thursday nights. So I would wake up at about 3 in the morning on Friday morning, which in Israel, Friday is Saturday, because their weekend is Friday, Saturday. So the start of the weekend. So everyone would want to go out Thursday night, and sometimes I would. But then I would wake up at 3. I would throw cold water on my face. I'd set up my laptop in our kitchen, and I would broadcast from Israel at 3 o'clock in the morning. So if you look back on those videos, you can actually see the sun rising in the background.
Oh, wow.
Most of our podcasts that year. For those 6 months, yeah. It was pretty interesting. I don't know if I could do it now. I don't know how I did it. It was just so important to me, and I loved doing it so much that somehow my body just made it work.
No, that's incredible. I mean, and that's a lot of commitment to get up at 3 in the morning. But, it definitely worked out. So for those people who are listening, who maybe they really want to take this path, you mentioned at the beginning that you talked with a young girl who was interested to get into conservation. What sort of tips in general would you have for someone that's interested to follow a similar path that you've taken?
Well, first I want to say that you don't have to work at a zoo to be a conservationist. So if you work at a tech firm, or you work at a law firm, or you work as a teacher in a school, you can be a conservationist. The way to be a conservationist is to promote green practices and to teach people about why they should care about wildlife and the environment. So you can do that in almost any setting. You can be the new captain of a green team in your company, or you can apply for a green business certification. There's a million ways that you can insert that into your daily life and still be a conservationist without kind of jumping ship. If there's something you're really good at and you enjoy doing, but you want to find a way to incorporate this, you can. There's opportunities out there. The other thing I will say is that zoos are not the only option. There's lots of other facilities out there. Like I mentioned, aquariums, but there's also places like the Wildlife Conservation Network. There's all sorts of nonprofits that focus on certain species and being ambassadors for them in this country or other countries. And there's lots of ways to take your specialty or your skills and apply them to this field without saying, well, I'm going to put down my keyboard and I'm going to pick up my poop shovel. There's a lot of different ways to do that.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. Well, we've covered just a broad range of topics, for those that are interested in getting into this field. Is there any other advice that you'd like to share? Is there anything we missed?
Well, I have kind of my own personal mantra about my career, about my life, all this kind of stuff. And I didn't have a very good way of saying it, so I'm going to steal one of my favorite comedians, Nick Offerman, his way of saying it, and that is, he says, paddle your own canoe. And basically what that means to me is that if something doesn't feel right, if something's not working out, fix it. And if you really want something, you can steer yourself in that direction. And so even if it's just starting a new job search, or it's volunteering on your weekends somewhere new, or it's making contacts and going to a conference with people that are like-minded, there's all sorts of ways that you can help steer yourself in the right direction. And you never know where your next experience is going to take you. And you won't know if you don't follow through with doing that thing, whatever it is. And so that's kind of the way that I've worked. And so it feels sometimes like my path has been very circuitous, but looking back on it, it all helped me get to where I was today.
I love that. That's excellent advice. So how can we learn more about TWIS and about the San Francisco Zoo?
Yeah, so you can go to, they both have websites. So TWIS is twis.org, TWIS.org. You can also follow us on Twitter at TWISScience, and you can follow me at Blair's Menagerie on Twitter for all sorts of animal pictures from the zoo and animal science news from Blair's Animal Corner, which is my segment on TWIS. You can also go to TWIS's YouTube station, which is twis.org/YouTube. And then feel free to join us during our live show, which again is Wednesday nights at 8 o'clock Pacific time. And you can join our chat room. You can just check our Twitter feed. We always let you know how. And then the zoo, you can go to sfzoo.org. You can follow the zoo on Twitter, also at sfzoo. And feel free to come and visit the zoo, and maybe you'll see me there. You can also email me. My email, the best way to reach me is blairbaz@twis.org.
Awesome. Well, we will definitely be tuning in. And I just have one very last question this made me think of. Do you have a favorite animal?
I do, the hippopotamus.
Okay, and why is the hippopotamus your favorite?
It's hard for me to put my finger on.
Okay.
But there's something about an animal that in some ways looks so awkward and silly and kind of almost bumbling, but then an animal that has such raw power. They're the most dangerous animal in Africa.
Oh, wow.
And they can run over 35 miles an hour. Their ivory in their mouth is stronger than elephant ivory. So I just love that idea of an animal who looks so kind of roly-poly and adorable, but packs such an amazing punch. I also have a personal affinity for animals with huge mouths in relation to their head. My favorite animal is the Chaco horned frog, which is also called the Pac-Man frog, and they're called that because they have a giant mouth.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, Blair, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, no problem. This was super fun.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher so you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.